April, on flight AS-417 from Atlanta to San Francisco at an altitude of 11,000 meters, a black child screamed in pain. Scalding hot coffee had been spilled directly onto his arm. Right there in first class, where everyone pretended not to notice. Everyone, except one person, Elena Tran, a Vietnamese-American chief flight attendant, with 15 years of experience and a scar of her own, one that had never fully healed. Flight AS-417, en route from New York to San Francisco, took off quietly in the golden light of sunset, reflecting off the fuselage of Ether Sky Airways. In the first-class cabin, where every detail was crafted to project power and prestige, a young black boy sat by the window, eyes wide with wonder, watching the clouds drift outside. Caleb Monroe, 12 years old, a science prodigy recently named National Young Scientist of the Year, was on his way to an awards ceremony at Stanford University. Beside him sat Danielle Monroe, a single mother, her face beaming with pride, though her eyes couldn't quite hide the tension. It was the first time the two had ever stepped into the world of true first class. Not far across the aisle sat Grayson Wolfe, CEO of pharmaceutical giant Viranex Biotech, in a slate-gray suit, Cartier sunglasses, and a gold ring on his pinky. His eyes had flicked toward Caleb more than once, each glance laced with a quiet, measured disdain. That hadn't strayed once in the last 30 minutes. Elena Tran, chief flight attendant with 15 years of experience, moved gracefully down the aisle with a tray of coffee in hand. Her steps were calm, her uniform crisply pressed, every gesture precise. But in Elena's eyes, something in the cabin felt off. The air was taut, as though drawn tight by an invisible thread. As she leaned down to pour a cup for a nearby passenger, Grayson Wolfe suddenly reached across the aisle, swinging his arm deliberately. His cup tipped. A stream of steaming liquid flung directly onto Caleb's arm. Ah! Caleb's scream tore through the cabin's quiet. Napkins scattered, voices rose, a flurry of movement. Danielle lunged for her son, lifting his arm, hands trembling as she peeled away the soaked fabric. Caleb's brown skin was blistered and raw, angry red patches already rising. Steam still floated gently from the surface. That was completely accidental, Wolfe said flatly, without even looking at the child. Eleanor froze, but as her eyes flicked to Wolfe, she saw it. This wasn't an accident, not carelessness. It was intentional. The faint curl at the corner of Wolfe's lips. Not quite a smile, but enough for Eleanor, who had served hundreds of powerful men, to recognize the hidden satisfaction in his gaze. A chill ran down her spine. Old memories stirred, clawing their way up from where she had buried them. But before they could rise, her eyes locked onto the boy's hand, gripped in pain by his mother's own. At 30,000 feet, Elena knew she stood at a crossroads: stay silent as she had for 15 years, or do what her heart was now demanding. The answer wasn't clear yet, but the burn on Caleb's arm was undeniable. Elena Tran stood frozen in the first-class aisle of Flight AS-417. While the passengers around her were still caught in the chaos following Caleb Monroe's scream, her mind had drifted somewhere else, to a memory long buried, one that ached deeper than any physical wound ever could. 30 years earlier, Garden City International Airport. An 8-year-old Vietnamese girl, Elena, clutched her mother's hand tightly at an old stadium where airline families gathered on weekends. Outside the row of technician housing, angry voices echoed from Maintenance Bay 3. A small man, Tran Van Hoy, Eleanor's father, was being escorted out by 3 men in white dress shirts. His face was strangely calm, but his eyes, those eyes would haunt Elena's memory forever. Sweetheart, never go against the system. It doesn't care about right or wrong. It only wants silence. They said her father had caused internal disruption. For submitting a report about unresolved technical faults, the report was never reviewed. Instead, he was placed on indefinite suspension. 3 days later, the entire family was forced to vacate their technician housing, given only 24 hours to pack and leave. Now in the sky above, the soft sobs of Caleb mixed with the hum of the aircraft. Elena held her breath. The acrid scent of scorched coffee still lingered. She had seen this before. Not the exact situation, but the same pattern. An ordinary person, moral, competent, crushed for daring to threaten the interests of someone powerful. And since the day her father was dismissed, Elena had made a vow to herself: never become a victim, never speak up, never resist. She had chosen survival. Through perfection, through professionalism, through strict adherence to protocol. She had survived 15 years by refusing to look injustice in the eye. But today, Caleb Monroe sat before her, his arm blistered and red, his mother's panicked eyes searching and landing on her. Elena began to tremble, not from fear of Grayson Wolfe, but because she knew if she stayed silent, if she bowed her head, then it wouldn't just be Caleb suffering injustice. Her father, long gone, would be silenced all over again. The first-class cabin had gradually settled. But inside Eleanor Tran, the storm was only just beginning. She had handled hundreds of in-flight incidents. Vomiting passengers, seat disputes, even cardiac emergencies. But never had she faced an act so deliberate, so cold, and so violent, especially from a priority elite passenger. In the cockpit, Captain Thomas Grant was reviewing incident summaries on his screen. Eleanor knocked gently on the door. "Captain, I need to report a serious incident. An assault on a minor passenger with hot liquid, with signs of intent." Grant looked up, his expression conflicted. "Ms. Tran, this is Grayson Wolfe we're talking about. He's a primary donor to our VIP flyer program. Are you certain?" "I witnessed it firsthand," Elena replied, her voice trembling. Not from fear, but from the effort to stay composed. A heavy silence passed. Then Grant gave a faint nod. "I'll forward the report to corporate, but from this point on, handle it. Gently. Don't escalate. Don't disturb the cabin." 10 minutes later, an internal call from headquarters connected directly to the cabin crew panel. On the screen appeared a name Elena knew far too well: Samuel Drake, EVP, Ether Sky Airways. The face of a sharp-eyed, middle-aged man filled the screen, his voice clipped and precise. "Elena, we've received word about the incident between Mr. Wolfe and the child. It will be handled internally. But right now, we need you to do something very simple." He leaned forward, lowered his voice. "Go back to first class. Apologize to Mr. Wolfe for the misunderstanding. Do that, and this ends here. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence. But his eyes said enough. "If not, your 15-year career could end up filed away, just like your father's." Elena hung up, said nothing. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the safety manual. She had lived her entire life by the code: do your job well. Don't disrupt the system. But in this moment, the choice was no longer unclear. If she stayed silent, she would remain safe. Wolfe would return to his penthouse. Caleb would return home with a scar, and history would repeat itself. If she spoke up, she could lose everything. Her job, her income, her last chance to redeem her father's name. But she would keep the one thing she had left, her conscience. She walked back into the first-class cabin. All passengers were seated. Wolf reclined in his seat, swirling his wine, a look of smug anticipation on his face. Elena stood tall before him. All eyes turned to her. "I have no apology to offer you." The air went still. "Instead, I've submitted a full incident report to both the captain and executive operations. The injuries have been documented, witness statements recorded, and images archived. When this plane lands, airport security will be waiting at the gate." Wolf slowly set his glass on the tray. His expression shifted from arrogance to fury. "You just signed your own termination notice. You realize that, don't you?" Eleanor bowed her head slightly, not in submission, but to steady herself. A quiet reminder not to tremble before power. "If that's the price to protect a child," she whispered, "I'll pay it." Less than 10 minutes after Elena's refusal to apologize, a signal buzzed through her crew headset. "Elena Tran, please report immediately to the rear of the first-class cabin to meet with the flight operations supervisor." She left the cabin, walking past the passengers' stares, a mix of surprise, discomfort, and quiet avoidance. At the crew rest area, Captain Thomas Grant stood beside a man in a navy blue suit. The regional flight operations manager, a representative from Ether Sky, present on all VIP flights. "Ms. Tran," the man began, his tone devoid of emotion, "due to failure to follow protocol in handling a high-priority passenger, the executive board has ordered your immediate suspension from duty." Eleanor said nothing. "I will take over your role as lead cabin attendant for the remainder of the flight." He handed her a printed notice, an official suspension, effective immediately, before the plane had even landed. "And I've been instructed to ask that you publicly apologize to Mr. Grayson Wolf in front of the first-class cabin to ensure psychological comfort for our VIP clientele." Elena looked him directly in the eye. "I won't apologize to a man who poured hot coffee on a child's arm." The air in the crew area thickened like lead. "Very well," the manager replied, slipping the notice back into his briefcase. "You will be escorted off the aircraft upon landing. Human resources will be waiting." Back in first class, Elena no longer had an official role, but Caleb Monroe's eyes were locked on her. He sat curled into his mother's lap, his arm still bandaged, lips tightly pressed together. He wasn't crying, wasn't complaining of pain, but in those eyes was a quiet confusion. Why is the adult who tried to protect me the one being punished? Danielle Monroe stood up as Elena passed by, reaching out to take her hand. "You don't deserve this," Danielle said, her voice shaking. "Thank you for not staying silent." Eleanor gently squeezed her hand, then knelt beside Caleb and said softly, "Truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. It just needs someone brave enough not to back down." Across the aisle, Grayson Wolf watched the scene unfold, arms crossed, with a faint, perverse amusement. He raised his wine glass, took a sip, then leaned toward the passenger beside him. "Some people don't know their place until they're reminded," he smiled. Flight AS-417 began its descent. The acting lead attendant made the announcement. "We are preparing to land at San Francisco International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." In the first-class cabin, the tension still lingered like stale smoke. Elena Tran, though officially suspended, sat upright in the auxiliary crew seat near the emergency exit, quietly observing, still carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had worn the title of chief flight attendant for 15 years. Caleb Monroe rested gently against his mother's shoulder, his wide eyes fixed on Elena, as if searching for something reassurance or maybe just a simple hope that an adult wouldn't abandon him in the silence of this world. Just as the wheels touched the runway, a silver-haired woman in seat 4D stood up before the seatbelt sign turned off. "Ms. Elena," she said softly, her hand trembling as she held up a phone. "Dr. Miriam Blake, retired professor of sociology," her voice low but sharp, piercing through the compressed air like a needle. "I recorded everything Mr. Wolfe did, including the moment." He smiled afterward. Elena looked up, stunned. "I'm not good with technology, but the footage is already backed up to the cloud. And I'll testify. If you're willing to stand up, then I won't back down either." Minutes later, as passengers began gathering their belongings, a whisper reached Elena's ear as she bent to collect her carry-on. "I've got your back." She turned. It was Isabel Cruz, a young flight attendant recently transferred from domestic to international routes, adjusting her uniform. "I was once penalized for reporting a harassing passenger, but that time I had no witnesses. This time, I have you. We have the video, and we have me." Isabel walked toward the cabin doors without waiting for a reply. But the message had already landed. A small crack had appeared in the wall of isolation Eleanor had carried for years. As Eleanor exited the aircraft, walking the opposite direction from the disembarking passengers, a gentle hand rested on her shoulder. "Ms. Tran," a firm, older male voice. She turned. A tall, lean black man stood before her, close-cropped silver hair, a charcoal grey shirt beneath a worn velvet blazer. He handed her a business card. "Jeremiah King, civil rights attorney, retired." His eyes held the weight of too many unjust courtrooms. "I didn't come here by accident. I heard the boy scream. I saw the burn. I saw Wolfe's eyes. If you're ready to fight, you won't be fighting alone." Eleanor clutched the card like a lifeline, a drowning woman grabbing the first float that finally appeared. Allies don't always shout in public, but they show up when you need them most. In the darkest moments, some people still carry the light. A small office in Mission Hill, south of San Francisco. The fading daylight filtered through old shutters, casting shadows across law diplomas layered with dust. His name was still faintly etched on the worn wooden plaque. Jeremiah King, civil rights attorney. The room felt like the man himself. Weathered, quiet, but never withdrawn from what was right. Elena Tran sat across from him, still clutching a cup of ginger tea. She hadn't said much about herself, but he already knew. "You're the daughter of Tran Van Hee," Jeremiah began, eyes still on the case file in front of him. "I once read the technical report your father submitted to the State Aviation Board. He was right, but crushed by those in power." Elena looked up, eyes widening. "Your father was one of the first to speak out about falsified safety standards at Garden City Airport. I was invited to assist as legal counsel back then, but I declined." The air in the room seemed to still. "I was afraid. I was young. I thought if I got involved, I'd lose everything I'd worked for. So I stayed silent." A deep, painful pause. "Since then, I've won many cases. I've defended many people. But not a day has passed that I haven't remembered your father." Jeremiah slid an old tablet toward Eleanor. On the screen played the video sent to him just 1 hour after the flight landed. from Dr. Miriam Blake. Crystal clear footage. Wolf tilting the coffee cup, the subtle curl of his lips, and Caleb's scream echoing in the background. The sound filled the room. This is no longer speculation. This is evidence. Jeremiah opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of documents, a formal request for investigation submitted to the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA). A letter requesting a congressional hearing from the U.S. Transportation Oversight Committee, a plan to file a civil lawsuit against Ether Sky Airways and Viranex Biotech. He looked at Elena, his voice low but resolute. I stayed silent once. I won't do it again. But I can't move forward unless the person at the center of this is ready to step into the light. Elena nodded gently. I'm not my father. I'm not a fighter, but I know. I won't let Caleb grow up carrying the kind of memory I had to live with. Jeremiah offered a rare smile. Then let's begin. This time, he wasn't fighting to make peace with the past, but to protect the future of a boy and the honor of a man whose truth was once buried. 2 days after landing, on national television, Grayson Wolf appeared in a press conference held at the Viranex Biotech headquarters. Camera flashes popped. His voice was warm, well-rehearsed. I deeply regret the unfortunate incident on flight AS-417. I was simply trying to place my coffee down and accidentally bumped into the seat. A pure accident. Sadly, some individuals are now trying to exploit this to attack my success. He forced out a few tears, hand over his chest. We're living in a time where anyone successful can become a victim of cancel culture. On social media, a smear campaign erupted. An anonymous page posted, Ether Sky flight attendant has history of provoking passengers. Tabloid sites began circulating false claims that Elena Tran had previously been reprimanded for unprofessional behavior, all fabricated yet spreading at lightning speed. Within the airline industry, Elena was removed from all internal crew groups. Her email account was deactivated, her health benefits suspended under the pretext of an ongoing internal review. For Caleb and Danielle Monroe, the storm came unannounced. At school, Caleb overheard whispers. His mom made it all up for money. He's just a prop for her fame. A 12-year-old who had just won Young Scientist of the Year was now being asked to submit a written explanation to the school board, just because he appeared in a controversial video. Danielle, who worked 2 part-time jobs, received an unexpected notice from her building management. Her lease renewal had been denied. No explanation, no justification. In a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, Elena received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. Ms. Tran, a man's voice said, cold and mechanical. I'm calling from the legal office of Viranex. At the instruction of our client, we're issuing a formal warning. If you continue to disseminate false information, we will file a defamation suit, and damages will not be less than $5 million. Eleanor went silent. Additionally, the voice continued, we recommend you review the financial status, rental agreements, and employment situations of those currently supporting you. We would sincerely regret if they suffered consequences due to your unwise decisions. That evening, in Jeremiah King's law office, the news replayed Wolf's interview. As the room sat in quiet silence over dinner, Caleb was quiet, but the light in his eyes, that innocent sparkle, was gone. Elena stood up and looked at Jeremiah. Did I make a mistake? I thought I was strong enough, but they're tearing apart every piece of my life. Caleb's life, even his mother's. Jeremiah set down his chopsticks, his weathered eyes resting on her. No, you didn't make a mistake. This is what those in power always do. They create storms from the top, to force those beneath to kneel. He paused. But if you collapse now, that's all they need, to prove that justice is nothing more than a foolish dream. For small people, 4 days after the incident, an email arrived in Elena Tran's personal inbox. No subject, no message, just a single encrypted download link. She hesitated, then opened it in secure mode. The video file loaded. The footage was shaky but clearly captured. Grayson Wolfe aboard a private jet, yelling at a young female flight attendant. He barked at her to pour out the Middle Eastern passengers' wine into the toilet. It smells disgusting. When she refused, Wolfe moved in close, his face inches from hers, his voice like ice. I pay your salary, and I can make sure you never fly again. At the end of the clip, a note was attached. My name is Natalie Pierce. I was Wolfe's private flight attendant for 6 years. This is only a fraction of what I kept. When I saw Caleb's name and your photo online, I knew, this time I can't stay silent. That evening in Jeremiah King's law office, Elena, Danielle, and Caleb sat together, watching the footage. In the small room, no one spoke, only the sound of breath. Heavy, held, eyes quietly meeting in silence. Jeremiah nodded, his gaze hardening. This isn't about a flight accident anymore. This is a long-standing, deliberate system of abuse. And now we have proof. Natalie joined them via Zoom. Her face was slightly blurred from a poor connection, but her voice was unwavering. I was once told to alter flight logs. Erase all mentions of his violent behavior. I saved the originals. I also have internal files from Viranex showing Wolfe was reported for racial misconduct at least 4 times, but every case was buried or handled internally. Elena asked softly, why now? After all these years? Natalie paused. Because of Caleb. Because of the way he looked at you as they dragged you off that plane. And because I'm done being part of the silence. The next day, Jeremiah and Elena submitted the second tape to an independent investigative journalism outlet and forwarded it to the FAA's Office for Civil Rights. At the same time, Jeremiah began building the foundation for a class action lawsuit, not just against Wolfe, but against every individual and entity that enabled him. New headlines began to surface online. Leaked video shocks industry. Viranex CEO accused of abuse across flights. A second voice emerges, silence or complicity. Ether Sky scandal may trigger industry-wide reckoning. At the same moment, an anonymous email reached Jeremiah's inbox. The first line read, I used to work in Ether Sky's legal department. I'm willing to testify. If you can protect me. A storm was brewing. This was no longer the story of a single flight. This was the death rattle of a system that had spent years using money and power to bury the truth. 8 a.m., Jeremiah King's office. The walls were now covered in layers of post-it notes, diagrams, and timelines, connecting evidence, testimonies, and the web of relationships between individuals inside Ether Sky and Viranex Biotech. At the center of it all was a red square, Grayson Wolfe, linked to Wolfe's private jet division, Ether Sky's HR department, the VIP passenger program, and even several political donors involved in campaign financing. Jeremiah stood in front of a small group, no longer scattered individuals, but now a unified front. Elena Tran, her eyes no longer fearful, sharp now, like surgical steel. Danielle Monroe, no longer the silent mother. Dr. Miriam Blake holding a list of past passengers who had filed complaints against Wolf. Isabel Cruz, the young flight attendant who had just sent a formal report to HR, knowing retaliation would come, but sending it anyway. Natalie Pierce, joining via Zoom, holding documents from a March London flight where Wolf had verbally assaulted a Muslim family and had them removed. James Cole, a Filipino maintenance engineer, forced to resign after refusing to ignore a system malfunction on Wolf's aircraft. Linda Yates, the former legal staffer at Ether Sky who had sent the anonymous email, now stepping forward. She carried a massive file, internal emails, tampered reports, directives to soften language in incident write-ups involving platinum-level passengers. They were no longer isolated voices. They were a network, a task force, a movement. The draft for the class action lawsuit was finalized, bearing the title Monroe et al. Versus Ether Sky Airways and Veranex Biotech Incorporated for violations of civil rights, willful concealment of assault, and enabling systemic racial discrimination. Simultaneously, formal complaints were filed with the FAA Office for Civil Rights, the Senate Transportation Committee, the Congressional Civil Rights Commission at Liberty Hall, Capital City. The second tape was submitted to digital forensic analysts to confirm its authenticity and verify no tampering. Meanwhile, Jeremiah filed an official request to suspend Grayson Wolf from his position pending full investigation. An investigative journalist from a major news network reached out. We've received leaked internal data from Ether Sky via an anonymous source. If the plaintiffs consent, we'd like to produce a special nationwide broadcast. Jeremiah nodded. But no clickbait, no drama. This isn't a scandal, it's justice. In the corner of the office, Caleb Monroe quietly sketched as the meeting unfolded. He looked up and asked softly, "Ms. Elena, what if we don't win this time?" Elena walked over and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Then we'll make sure they fear trying it again. And the ones who come after us will go even farther." Liberty Hall, Capital City, a vast hearing chamber. Etched into the wooden paneling was the seal of the Congressional Committee on Transportation and Civil Aviation. The press was limited, but the hearing was being live-streamed on official national platforms. Seated at a wooden desk beneath a small nameplate, Caleb Monroe, witness. A 12-year-old boy blinked under the lights. His light grey suit hung a bit loose on his slender frame, but his dark eyes were resolute. In front of him sat a panel of senators, policy advisors, legal counsels, airline executives, and countless viewers watching from across the country. Jeremiah King nodded from a seat in the audience. Eleanor sat beside Danielle, who tightly held her son's hand. The chairperson's gavel echoed across the chamber. We will now hear testimony from witness Caleb Monroe, who was injured in the incident on Flight AS-417. Caleb stood. His voice was small, but clear. "My name is Caleb Monroe. Last year, I won a national science competition for a project on treating burns using biological enzymes. I didn't think I'd become the first real test subject for my own project." A subtle murmur moved through the room. "On that flight, I didn't do anything wrong. But a man, very powerful, very rich, poured coffee on my arm. He said it was an accident, but I saw the way he looked at me before he did it. And I realized something I'd never read in any textbook. Not everyone gets treated the same, especially when your skin doesn't look like theirs." An elderly senator bowed his head. A female FAA official wiped her eyes. But Caleb went on. Unshaken, "I used to believe science could fix everything. But no one's invented a cure for people who treat others as lesser because of skin or money. I thought justice was for everyone, but then I saw Ms. Elena, who stood up for me, get dragged off a plane, lose her job, and have lies spread about her. I saw my mom, who works 2 jobs, accused of chasing money, when all she wanted was for her son to be safe. Caleb looked up, meeting the gaze of every committee member for the first time. If no one had recorded that video, I might have been forced to apologize for making a scene. So, how many people stayed silent? How many kids like me didn't have a video, didn't have a lawyer, didn't have anyone standing next to them? The room held its breath. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I was lucky. Luckier than those who had no one. I hope all of you, people with power, won't just write down what I said, but will change the rules, so kids like me won't have to be here again. When Caleb finished, the room was still. Then a single round of applause rose from an Asian American senator, then spread across the hall. The broadcast cut to major cities, New York, Atlanta, Chicago, where millions watched and quietly wept. In a small cafe in Garden City, where Eleanor's father had been pushed out of aviation 3 decades ago, an old mechanic sat staring at the screen. He nodded slowly. If Hay were still alive, he'd be crying. 48 hours after Caleb Monroe's testimony, morning headlines flooded every major news outlet. A 12-year-old voice unmasks the airline industry. The science prodigy speaks on burns and justice, and America listens. Number sign justice for Caleb spreads nationwide. Ether Sky and Vironex in turmoil. New York Stock Exchange. Vironex Biotech, the company Grayson Wolf founded, went into freefall after a coalition of ethical investors publicly announced their divestment. We cannot continue funding a corporation that enables systemic racial discrimination, declared the Massachusetts Teachers Retirement Fund. In just 3 days, Vironex lost nearly $400 million in market value. Market analysts used one phrase to describe the crisis: public trust collapse. At Ether Sky Airways, the tension was razor-sharp, internal chaos, media swarming every terminal. Flight attendants from 7 major airports signed a petition demanding reform in the treatment of minority passengers and staff. A leaked internal email to Ether Sky's executive board read, "We risk losing our entire premium passenger base if we don't act immediately." An independent investigation from Civil Skies Watch released a damning report. Over the past 5 years, Ether Sky received more than 1,200 discrimination complaints, only 4 of which were officially investigated. 89% of complainants during that time were non-white or from minority backgrounds. A media, political, and financial earthquake began to ripple across the industry. Major airlines like Skylinks and Aurora Jet announced a full review of internal policy. The FAA launched a sweeping investigation in partnership with the Federal Justice Committee. Inside Vironex Biotech's headquarters, the board held an emergency meeting. The CFO reported coldly, "Half our supply chain partners are reviewing their contracts. 3 insurers have suspended coverage. And the shareholder council is preparing a vote on Mr. Wolf's executive status." Grayson Wolf, in his oak-paneled office overlooking the city, sat speechless, his face pale, watching Caleb's testimony on television. A 12-year-old boy, no money, no private legal team, no PR firm, had shaken him from his throne with the truth. At Jeremiah King's law office, Elena Tran held an email in her hands from the Congressional Civil Rights Committee. We formally invite Ms. Tran to join the advisory panel on the Aviation Justice Reform Act. Role, co-founder of the Passenger Dignity Act initiative. She looked up. Danielle wept. Jeremiah said only one sentence. We haven't won yet. But they're starting to retreat. 8 a.m., 42nd floor conference room, Viranex Biotech headquarters. A closed-door meeting between the executive board and strategic shareholders began under heavy silence. All eyes turned toward the empty chair at the center of the room. Grayson Wolf had not shown up. He's not coming, one major shareholder asked. His lawyer informed us Wolf will not participate in absurd formalities, the general counsel replied, visibly irritated. A thick dossier was placed on the table. Clear, documented, signed by independent investigators. Systemic racial discrimination, abuse of power toward employees, witness intimidation, interference with medical and legal documentation across both commercial and private flights. None of this, the CFO murmured, is in the gray zone anymore. We are sitting on a live bomb. Another voice, an international investment fund representative, spoke coldly. I do not bankroll a CEO who could be subpoenaed by Congress at any moment. 9:14 a.m. The vote commenced. Result, 7 in favor, 0 against, 1 not present. Grayson Wolf was indefinitely suspended from his role as CEO. Viranex Biotech announced the decision to the press 2 hours later. The brief statement contained a single sentence that went viral across social media. No one, not even the founder, is exempt from accountability when they violate the core values of this company. At Ether Sky Airways, a simultaneous internal memo was sent to all employees. Elena Tran has been officially invited to serve as an independent advisor to the Corporate Culture Reform Council. She will help establish new standards for equity, anti-discrimination, and the protection of passenger and employee dignity. Also included was a short but seismic update. EVP Samuel Drake, the man who had personally ordered Eleanor's suspension, had retired early under a private agreement. Later that afternoon, at Ether Sky's press conference, CEO James Whitfield appeared before the cameras. We were wrong, not just in how we handled the AS417 incident, but in allowing a culture of silence and compliance to persist for too long. From today forward, all discrimination complaints will be investigated independently, and no one, no matter how wealthy, will be allowed to stand above the dignity of others. And then, Elena Tran stepped up to the podium, for the first time since being dragged off that plane more than 3 months ago. The lights hit her face, still solemn but unshaken. I'm not here for revenge, she said, her voice steady and clear. I'm here to make sure no one else gets pulled off a flight the way I was. Just for daring to speak the truth. From a quiet corner of the press room, Caleb held his mother's hand, eyes locked on Elena. Danielle smiled and whispered, You see, sweetheart, sometimes we don't need to scream. We just have to stand firm and wait for the system to tremble. When it fears losing the only thing it truly values, the public. A quiet afternoon inside Jeremiah King's law office. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating a desk where 3 thick files lay, stamped on each in blue ink. Confidential settlement offer requires full NDA. From Ether Sky Airways, an offer for Elena Tran to receive $850,000 as compensation for reputational damage and career disruption. With conditions: no public mention of the AS417 incident, no participation in media, advocacy or litigation related to the case. From Viranex Biotech, an offer for Danielle and Caleb Monroe to receive $1 million as compensation for psychological and medical distress. The three of them sat in silence. Danielle spoke softly. "That money could put my son through any school he wants, pay off debt, buy a house, a stable life." Caleb didn't speak, but his eyes were locked on one phrase: non-disclosure. Eleanor held the file, reading every line. Her hand trembled slightly. Not from emotion, but from clarity. Jeremiah spoke, voice deep. "I've seen many people sign. They weren't wrong. They weren't weak. They were just tired. But if you sign, the ones who come after you will have nothing to stand on." Elena placed the file back down, resolute. "If my father were still alive, he'd ask me, 'Are you repeating the old path?' And this time my answer is, number, I'm not signing. I won't sell silence in exchange for a title." Danielle nodded, slowly but firmly. "I won't sign either. I raised Caleb to live with integrity. I can't teach him now. That silence is the only way to survive." All eyes turned to Caleb. He looked up and said simply, "If I stay quiet, someone else will get burned like me. And no one will know." The decision was made. No vote, no delay. They rejected every settlement offer. And in that moment, something vast and deeply human happened. They weren't richer, but they were freer than at any point since Flight AS-417. That night the news broke. 3 victims in landmark aviation scandal reject nearly $2 million in settlements to pursue justice. On social media, one user wrote, "They didn't sign, they didn't sell the dream, so we don't get to look away." The hashtag #we don't settle exploded across Twitter. Non-profits, academics, students all shared the story as a new symbol of modern-day courage. 3 months after the Liberty Hall hearing, Ether Sky Airways headquarters, inside a newly renovated glass-walled room, a nameplate engraved on the door reads, "Division of Civil Rights and Passenger Dignity. Chief Advisor, Elena Tran." Elena walked into her first meeting as the leader of an unprecedented initiative in the airline industry. Seated before her was a diverse panel: civil rights attorneys, trauma-informed counselors, representatives of flight attendant unions, and passengers who had experienced discrimination. "I'm not here to polish corporate image," Elena began. "I'm here to make sure every child of color, every Asian or Black staff member, and anyone who's ever been told you don't belong here is never silenced again." No one in the room chuckled. They all nodded. They understood. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of STEM for Equity, Caleb Monroe, now wearing a better-fitting suit, received the Aurora Foundation's Freedom in Science Scholarship in front of more than 300 rising scientists from across the U.S. Then came a surprise announcement. Caleb Monroe will be invited as an honorary advisor for our Diversity in Science Education program, aimed at nurturing talent from marginalized communities. The 13-year-old boy, once scolded by coffee on a flight, was now seated at the same table as national education policy shapers. Danielle Monroe, after years of juggling 2 part-time jobs, was appointed Director of Community Communications for a program supporting single parents in the aviation sector. "I spent most of my life thinking I was just an outsider," Danielle said during her swearing-in. "Now I understand. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the most powerful, but from the heart that refuses to stay silent." At major airports nationwide, EtherSky unveiled its new campaign banners. "No matter where you're from, you belong here." Available in Spanish, Vietnamese, and French. And finally, at the US Capitol, a new bill was brought to a vote, the Passenger Dignity Act. Key proposals: mandatory creation of independent departments within airlines to investigate discrimination complaints, empowering passengers to file complaints directly to the FAA, bypassing airline intermediaries, prohibition of internal retaliation against employees who report misconduct. Vote result: 67 in favor, 33 against. Bill passed. Jeremiah King, once fully retired, was invited to speak before the chamber. "A burned child is not just an incident," he said. "It's a signal that the system itself needs healing." On the first day the law took effect, on an Ether Sky flight from Chicago to D.C., Elena Tran, Caleb Monroe, and Danielle Monroe were invited as honored guests. The flight attendant serving them didn't bow, nor perform fake pleasantries. She simply smiled warmly and said, "I joined this profession because of you. You're the reason I know I can be a flight attendant and still keep my dignity." Elena gave a slight nod. She didn't reply. She just looked at Caleb, who was now scribbling notes in a fresh notebook. Flight AS-417 once opened a wound. Today's flight opened something else. A new era, where silence is no longer the only choice. Flight number AS-417, but this time not listed in complaint records. It now lives on the honor wall of Ether Sky, a symbol of transformation. Outside the cabin window, the sky stretched smooth as silk. In first class, 3 passengers sat side by side. Not through privilege, not through fame, but because they had crossed the threshold where no one could deny their presence anymore. Elena Tran sat upright in a crisp white shirt, her gaze calm and steady. Beside her, Danielle Monroe gently held the hand of Caleb. Taller now, still soft in the face, but with an unmistakably wiser look in his eyes. Caleb turned to Eleanor. "Ms. Eleanor, do you think your father can see what's happening today?" Elena didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at clouds drifting like memory. Where 30 years ago a Vietnamese man was cast out of his career for daring to speak the truth. "If he were still alive," she said slowly, "he'd be proud. Because you didn't just heal a burn on your skin. You healed wounds my family carried for decades." The plane ascended gently. No more wolf. No more phrases like, "People like them don't belong here." Only those who chose to stand up. And the system that was forced to change, because they wouldn't back down. On the ground, the story of Flight AS-417 didn't end with a hearing or a law. Schools began teaching Caleb's testimony in civics classes. Airlines across the country signed a joint pledge to uphold the principle of unconditional dignity. A new scholarship fund, the Huy Tran Foundation, was established to support Asian American students facing discrimination in engineering and aviation fields. But the most powerful legacy wasn't in headlines. It was in the way a child, who once cried from a burn caused by someone's cruelty, now smiled, knowing he had the right to exist, the right to dream, and the right to walk into any space, without bowing his head. Elena turned to Caleb. "Are you afraid that someone might try to hurt you again one day?" Caleb thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I'm more afraid of silence." The plane soared through the clouds. Sunset light streamed over their row of seats. In Caleb's hands was a new notebook. This time not about burn treatments, but a science project on psychological recovery for children who experience discrimination. Scars will fade, but the lesson they leave becomes legacy. Not every powerful person wins. Not every small voice stays silent. And sometimes, it only takes one child in pain for the whole world to rewrite the rules. Not everyone gets the chance to flip the script. Not everyone is lucky enough to turn pain into purpose. But every time someone dares to stand, despite the cost, an entire system that once believed itself untouchable is forced to take a step back. Elena didn't begin this fight to become a symbol. She just didn't want another child to grow up carrying the same fear she once did. And Caleb, he didn't choose to be a victim. He simply chose not to stay silent, knowing that his pain might protect someone else. Their story isn't just about a flight. It's about every hallway, every office, every classroom, every seat where the voiceless are told to sit down and stay quiet. Because some scars fade, but others, when we dare to name them, become a voice. A voice that echoes not just in aircraft cabins or courtrooms, but in the choices we all face to play it safe or to seek justice, to survive or to live honestly. And if you find yourself standing at that crossroads between silence and truth, remember this: sometimes the world only needs one person to say no. And today, that person could be you.